When was the last time you came home from work, stared at the ceiling in the shower and thought, you know what, I'm done. I'll just disappear to some island and become a coconut influencer. We've all had that moment. It's funny how the moment we are born, we're automatically assigned to a piece of land, like software coming with default wallpaper. I was born in India, so I'm called Indian. But if you think about it, a newborn doesn't know anyone, doesn't understand borders, and definitely doesn't own the land they're born on. Yet we grow up with a nationality we never had to earn, and that identity becomes one of the strongest forms of security we carry in life. I only understood the depth of this truth after reading this story. And this isn't fiction. It's about a real organization called Chugach Alaska Corporation, headquartered in Anchorage, Alaska, one of the most successful native-owned corporations in the United States today. Before they became a brand, they were a community fighting for survival. And that story changed how I understand identity. It all begins in the winter of 1969, a place where even your shadow shivers. The wind in the Chugach region was wild. Snow slammed against wooden houses with the enthusiasm of a landlord knocking for rent. For the 2,000 native Alaskans living across the icy villages of Prince William Sound, life had always been a negotiation with nature. But this year, they were also in danger because their land was being taken away. Oil pipelines were being planned, companies were buying land, and the Chugach people, who are fishermen, hunters, who are tied to the ocean for thousands of years, suddenly found their very identity at risk. They had no wealth, no political power, no voice at the tables where decisions were being drafted. One cold evening, the leaders of the Chugach region received an official document from the US Department of the Interior. It includes the maps of the land that had been granted to them under the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, ANCSA. And they were stunned looking at their inheritance, which are nothing but mountains, glaciers, cliff faces, ice fields. Basically, the kind of land even Google Maps looks at and says, "Bro, you sure?" Beautiful, yes. Livable? Not at all. You could see the view from there, but not the future. The elders in the villages were confused. Some were angry. Some were simply tired. A few days later, the US government sent another letter saying they could sell their inheritance for money and receive funds for economic development instead. On paper, it sounded like a lifeline. So the entire community gathered in a place they called the Elders' House. It wasn't a house in the usual sense. It was a long wooden hall, warm with firelight, smelling of wood smoke and dried fish. Inside sat people whose stories were older than any government. There was an old man who remembered tales from the first Russian traders. An old woman who had survived the 1964 earthquake and said the land had shaken as if it were mourning something it loved. And there was Petter. Even in his 70s, his eyes were so sharp that he could spot a seal in the fog before anyone else. When the younger leaders came with the letter, the elders didn't ask about the compensation. They talked about land, spirit, and identity. Then the old woman said a line everyone understood and that shaped the next 50 years of their history. She said, "If the land forgets us, then we are already dead." In the end, the community made a decision. They chose their land over money and agreed upon one thing. No matter what, their grandchildren should not grow up as strangers on their own land. The Chugach people had a strange kind of resilience, the type that doesn't shout, doesn't protest loudly, doesn't riot. It simply endures. And endurance silently becomes strategy. After a year passed, the Chugach people did something nobody in Alaska expected. They formed a corporation called Chugach Alaska Corporation, CAC, owned entirely by the native shareholders among them, who had no business experience, no formal education in economics, just barely enough money to keep the lights on. Their fishing shacks were their boardroom table. There they typed their first company documents on borrowed typewriters. Even though they had no experience, they got something more powerful, a survival instinct sharpened by centuries. But the beginning was rough, brutally rough. They trusted the wrong consultants who pushed them into the oil industry. They bought land that later turned worthless. They lost everything they had left. The community felt ashamed. The dream seemed broken. But they didn't dissolve the corporation. They didn't sell it. They didn't give up. They kept showing up. And while the men battled legal messes, something powerful was happening in the background. The silent women were holding the community together. There was Mary Evanoff, working double shifts cleaning fish while typing corporate reports late at night. There was Sasha, who cooked for every gathering, made sure every elder stayed warm, and kept morale alive. And there was Anna, who quietly created the first education list, writing every child's dream, because, as she said, if we don't plan for their future, then why are we fighting for this corporation at all? Behind every brand, every movement, every revolution, there are invisible hands holding everything in place. The days are passing. The men kept returning home after dark and leaving again at dawn. This is continuing for weeks and weeks, like a routine. At this point in their story, my friend here, Rushi, the one who researched all this and even wrote the dialogues, started getting a very familiar feeling. And I don't know if it's just him or if other people go through this too. In his life, if everything is calm and steady, Monday is normal, Tuesday is normal, Wednesday is normal, Thursday is normal. Rushi immediately thinks something is fishy. He feels life is simply not designed to run smoothly for 4 days in a row. So by Friday, when chaos finally arrives, he's like, ah yes, now everything makes sense. Life is perfect. Just like that, in their story, there came the Exxon Valdez oil spill. It was one of the worst in history. Prince William Sound, the place where they live, was drowned in black. The morning after the spill, the Chugach people walked out of their homes to see the ocean, their provider, and it was black. Oil clung to stones. Seals struggled to breathe. The air tasted metallic. A young boy who is only 12 asked his father, "Has the sea died?" And his father, a fisherman who had never cried in front of anyone, turned away so his son wouldn't see his tears. The entire community gathered on the beach, staring at the destruction. It wasn't just an environmental disaster, it was a spiritual one. For the Chugach people, the ocean was a living ancestor. In that moment, the corporation's mission changed forever. They were no longer just fighting for economics. They were fighting to revive the soul of their land. Sometimes your mission becomes clear only after you lose what you took for granted. Pain can create purpose with surgical precision. When cleanup operations began after the disaster, Chugach men and women signed up not because it was a job, but because it felt like a duty, like tending to a wounded family member. Most had no formal training, no environmental degrees, no certifications. But they had intimacy with the land, something textbooks could never teach. During those months, ordinary villagers became heroes. Marcus slept only 3 hours a night because he refused to stop until every rock on his assigned beach was clean. Leanne kept going even after the cold burned her hands raw. And our old Petter, the elder, who insisted on joining the cleanup crew even at 70, saying, "I was born from this ocean. I will not watch it suffer alone." After that time, the Chugach people have realized something and asked themselves, what if we become a different kind of company? They looked at the Small Business Administration Program. It's a federal program that supported minority-owned businesses by giving them access to government contracts. Their own idea felt absurd to them, being a native corporation with no major industry, bidding for federal contracts and competing with big companies, jumping from canneries to defense maintenance. But desperation breeds imagination. For 2 years they studied the program, they attended meetings, they learned federal procurement rules, and slowly they started winning contracts. Years later, when Chugach finally made its first profit, every adult shareholder received a dividend check. It wasn't a big amount, but the day remains legendary. The elders wept, families celebrated, children danced around the post office. Not because of the money, but because it was proof that their sacrifices were not in vain. George Anderson, the leader who once feared they'd lose everything, held his check in silence. Someone asked him how he felt. He said, "This is not income, this is memory." The most meaningful victories are not financial, they are emotional. Chugach Alaska Corporation grew into a powerhouse, offering logistics, maintenance, environmental services, and federal contracts. Over the next decade, the corporation changed the very DNA of the community. Children went to college for the first time, homes were rebuilt, cultural festivals were funded, families finally had stability, lost traditions were revived. The land that once tried to swallow them now sheltered them. The people who were almost ignored by history became makers of their own destiny. When a community rises, it doesn't just build wealth, it repairs identity. And by the early 2000s, Chugach became one of the most successful native-owned corporations in the world. In this story, the Chugach people did not rise because they were rich, or educated, or powerful. They rose because they were patient, united, and unwilling to disappear. Their corporation was not just a business, it was a cultural resurrection, a statement to the world, we are still here. It's a brand built on grief, endurance, identity, and community resurrection. Most brands talk about purpose. Chugach lived it. Every contract, every dollar, every milestone carries 50 years of survival behind it. There are a lot of lessons in this story, but if I have to conclude with one, I will choose this. Your story becomes powerful the moment you decide it will not be forgotten. A tribute to the Chugach Alaska Corporation by Rushi.